Hey everyone, I'm going to touch base on Unit 8, Personality Disorders. Before we go into it, we're going to watch a little video in class. It's not in your PowerPoint, but I think it's kind of good to understand what is personality. So personality is kind of just the who we are. We all have distinct personalities, how we think, how we interact with other people, and there are a bunch of theories on personality, starting way back with Freud. Uh, when we look at Freud, personality is developed when we are young. There's a good intersection if we look at nature and nurture between and even with our personality. Um, how our parents interacted with us helps develop our personality. How we interacted with those around us is involved in personality. But then there is still some brain chemistry and brain changes that we can see. One good example of kind of those brain changes, if any of y'all remember way back to when you took psychology, was Phineas Gage. Phineas Gage was an American railroad construction worker way back in the 1800s. And he had an accident, and an iron rod was driven through his head and destroyed most of his left frontal temporal lobe. Um, and he somehow lived through this. However, he had such a profound change in his personality after this that most of his friends were like, he is no longer like who he used to be. He did have a change in his personality. And he was very much that first case that we looked at historically. His brain, I think, is still on display in like Harvard, his skull. Um, that looks at the brain's role in determining personality and how different parts of our brain kind of relate to it. So personality disorders, I think, are a fun lecture, but it's also hard because we have 10 that we have to go over and we have to go through. Um, our 10 personalities are divided into what we call clusters, cluster A, B, and C. And we can see there are some words that generally tend to relate to each cluster. So A tend to be odd, eccentric, weird. Cluster B, dramatic, emotional, erratic. And cluster C, a little bit more anxious or fearful. We can see some risk factors: neglect, trauma, sexual abuse, how we just grew up. So again, a mixture of nature and nurture. The diastasis stress model will always come into play. That temperament, those tendencies that we learned, along with that genetic underpinning and those different experiences that we have. So we're going to go through each of these by cluster, and we'll talk about there's 3 in cluster A, 4 in cluster B, and 3 in cluster C. So in our personality disorders, our first one is paranoid personality. And this is different than the paranoia that we see in psychosis, that we see in our delusions. If we were to talk about like paranoid schizophrenia, it's often like the CIA is out to get me, the FBI has been tracking me. Well, personality disorders have to do with how we relate to other people. So this is more so a long-standing distrust and suspiciousness with those in our personal life. This is going to be someone who always thinks that their significant other is cheating on them, even though there's no proof. It will be very easy to lose their trust in a relationship because there is no trust to begin with. They just don't trust you. They can be jealous and controlling. If something small happens, that could be it. Well, you said you were going here, but you really went here, and they will not forgive it. Anything that has to do with paranoia, we have high rates of hostility and aggression just because we're kind of already in this heightened emotional state. So when we look at nursing care, we have to be very straightforward. We have to limit set, very simple, neutral, right? We don't want to be too nice to this person. These individuals will reject treatment, and honestly, that's for most of our personality disorders. Almost all of our personality disorders will have no insight into the condition because as a whole, these individuals cannot recognize that there's anything wrong because it's who they are. Therapy for all of our personality disorders is our first line treatment. So all of our personality disorder patients will reject treatment, and therapy is the first line treatment for all of the patients. Though we will talk about medications on some of our slides, meds are so vague in personality disorders because the meds aren't going to do anything but help with the symptoms. So while we want our patient with paranoid personality disorder to be involved in therapy, group therapy can be hard because they're not always going to trust those in groups. So in class, we'll talk and do an activity where we look at individuals who might have this personality disorder in TV or movies. And we'll talk about this one. I don't know this one. Orange is the new black. My other students, when they gave me this as an example, called her crazy eyes, as someone who is very paranoid in those social relationships. I think this is a little bit more humorous than anything, but again, that person who's very controlling in a relationship. So schizoid personality disorder. Schizoid personality disorder is someone who is a loner. They have zero desire to have personal relationships. They might never have a close friendship. They might never have a romantic relationship. They might never date, might never have a sexual relationship. Because of how little they interact with others, when they do interact, they are so uncomfortable with that social interaction that they are just weird. They are just odd. Nursing care for this patient, we want to try not to be too nice or friendly. It can make them uncomfortable. We don't want to force them to socialize. And we want to make sure that others are not making fun of them, because that is a real risk. If this person kind of stays away, if they're on a unit, it might be hard. Again, psychotherapy is our main treatment. This is another individual who might struggle with group therapy because they just don't want to interact with others. Antidepressants, antipsychotics could help, but again, it's going to be dependent upon each patient. These disorders are very hard to work through. They're very hard to kind of like fix just because. So our example, if y'all have ever seen this, and I know some of y'all, it's an older movie now. This is Andy Stitzler. He is the character in The 40-Year-Old Virgin. And if we kind of watch the movie clip, especially in the beginning, he lives alone. He would rather spend time with his toys, like action figures, doing different activities kind of on his own versus hanging out with other people. When he does interact with other people, he's just eccentric. Like he's just kind of off if we think back to some of the scenes of him at work. Um, and especially in the beginning, he kind of is okay. Like, this is my life. And actually, this movie clip starts off like, I have a very fulfilling life. But his fulfilling life is just him. And in schizoid, this individual may be okay with that. So, schizotypal personality disorder. Again, odd or weird, very eccentric. I tend to think of this as a schizophrenia light. These are individuals who are very odd. Their dress is going to be odd. They're going to have this magical thinking, odd beliefs, very unusual. Honestly, this is an individual, if we ever want to wonder who joins cults, someone with schizotypal. They will believe all of the different things that we are talking about, that the cult is talking about. And they will join those extreme religions or those extremes, right? Jim Jones and the People's Temple. Let's go drink the Kool-Aid. That is your schizotypal. We do see this in individuals who have a first-degree relative with schizophrenia. There could be some minor hallucinations, delusions, but again, they usually can function okay within their life. Paranoia can be a risk with schizotypal. Um, Kind of just like the rest of cluster A, we have to respect the need for isolation, even in schizotypal. Had a patient when I worked in addiction who had a co-occurring diagnosis of substance abuse and schizotypal. And addiction is very much focused on group therapy. Well, we made an exception for that patient, and he did not have to go to all of the groups, or he could take a break and separate partway through a group if he needed to. So we have to look at what's going on. If we have strange beliefs, strange practices, cults, we got to recognize that and do our best to keep this patient safe. Again, psychotherapy. Psychotherapy is our treatment. Meds will be based on symptoms, based on what is going on with this patient. My example of who we might see this, Willy Wonka, right? Again, we're looking at our Gene Wilder, so we got to go back in time, right? He lives alone. He has his little Oompa Loompas. He's got these crazy ideas. His dress is weird. His behaviors and movements are weird. It's just different. So we're moving on to cluster B. So cluster B are dramatic, emotional, and erratic, and there are 4 of them. The first one we're going to talk about is our histrionic personality disorder. When I was in nursing school, this was always described to us as like the soap opera star, but not so much. Soap operas aren't quite as big, I think. Does anyone even still have cable nowadays as they used to be? So we're honestly going to talk about those like TikTok influencers. Oh my gosh, don't you know who I am? Like, you should be giving me this food for free. They are very dramatic, right? This is the drama queen. This is a high functioning personality disorder. We tend to see it more in females than in males. Emotionally, they're all over the place, very low frustration tolerance. If they feel challenged, they may be flirtatious, they may be provocative in how they are interacting. Because they are so focused on themselves, their relationships don't last and they have zero insight into how and why their relationships don't last. Um, Nursing care boundaries. We have to keep it professional. Concrete descriptive language. We cannot be vague. And honestly, concrete and descriptive language goes for all of our personality disorders. Just tell straight like it is. Don't try to like give them a nice answer. Role model and teach them assertiveness, right? Role model those appropriate behaviors. If they feel threatened, our cluster B is at high risk of danger, suicide. So always assess that. We have to look at true feelings. Group therapy, while beneficial, this is going to be a monopolizing patient. They're going to be that special interest pleader. They're going to constantly be making group about themselves. Meds will vary and it will be dependent upon who they are. Now, Regina George can go both ways, into a narcissist, which we'll talk about, and into a histrionic. And we see that where patients can go both ways. But there's not too many great examples besides your average TikToker of who is histrionic. This little YouTube page, Meow Medicine, does agree that she is histrionic, right? She wants to be the center of attention. She has her little posse. She wants it all to be about her. And that is something we see in histrionic. So cluster B, our next one, is our narcissist. So narcissistic personality disorder. This is usually one where when we think narcissist, and how we use it within society, where we're thinking pretty true. So narcissist is someone who thinks their poop doesn't stink. They think they're amazing. They have this exaggerated belief of their importance. They are very entitled. They have an inflated view of sense of self. However, they are very sensitive to criticism. Shame, fear of abandonment, all of this kind of comes into play. That's why when you criticize a narcissist, they tend to like try to like jump and blow up about it. Um, as nurses, we have to remember if we are treating someone who has narcissistic personality, we have to be neutral. We try not to power struggle, um, because they're going to constantly try to manipulate you. It is hard to treat because we have to have someone be able to say, hey, I'm a narcissist, and they have to confront their problems. Most narcissists are not going to be outspoken about that. Um, Again, therapy. There are no real meds that are going to help with this. Fun fact, if we look at the word narcissist, it comes from Greek mythology. And there was, depending on which version of Greek mythology we're looking at, a farmer soldier who was gorgeous and would reject everyone and just thought he was the best. And a minor Greek god cursed him to fall in love with something he would never be able to have. And he fell in love with his reflection in a puddle in a lake. Again, various different versions of the story. But Narcissus, as the Greek soldier farmer, fell in love with his reflection in a puddle and he stared at himself, stared at that reflection until he eventually died. Drowned, starved to death, various different versions. Gotta love Greek mythology. I mean, so this word has been around for quite some time. And my wonderful example of where we see this, how can we argue with Gaston, right? No one fights like Gaston. He's this great person. Of course, Belle, if we watch this scene, right? We're going to have this perfect life and all these fantasies, and you're going to rub my feet and you're going to take care of me, blah, 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 blah. And he could care less about what Belle thinks. He is the best to Gaston. Everyone else can kind of question it. So we're going to spend a little bit more time on this next personality disorder. It is called borderline personality disorder. And we got more than one slide. And in part, we have more than one slide because this is our most dangerous. Having traits of borderline personality disorder is marked with an increased risk of suicide. This personality disorder is the one we are going to see most often in the clinical setting. So in our psych units, we are more likely to see someone who has borderline personality disorder than any other personality disorder. And in part because they have these severe impairments in functioning. They struggle with emotional control. They're very labile. They're impulsive. And impulsivity is a huge risk factor for suicide. Unstable mood, unstable relationships, and large amounts of self-destructive behavior, whether it's our non-suicidal self-injury cutting, or whether it is frequent suicide attempts. Um, this is the patient who we have to be careful. We don't want to leave like a pen sitting on the table because they will grab that pen and impulsively stab themselves with it. They have chronic suicidal ideations. They have chronic self-harm. This is always not the best example, um, but to kind of explain it in a way, that's splitting. In splitting, there is no good and bad. It is either good or bad. The world is black and white. There is no gray. So you are either good or you are either bad. If you are good and you do something to hurt someone with borderline, you immediately go to bad. This is very much the person who is like, I love you, but then you do something and they're like, I hate you. Or if you're in a relationship with this person and you're like, hey, we need to break up, they immediately start to panic because they struggle with fears and they struggle with abandonment and fear of abandonment. They're afraid of separation. So if you are trying to break up with someone who is borderline, this is a person who's like, if you break up with me, I will kill myself. Sometimes what we see is accidental suicide. This is an individual who will attempt suicide and then immediately call someone for help. Though it happens kind of like that boy who cries wolf, eventually someone doesn't answer the phone and they accidentally overdose or they accidentally cut themselves too deep and bleed out. So we have to be extremely, extremely cautious with our borderline patients and suicide. If you are not thinking borderline and safety suicide, you are wrong. Um, in splitting, when we look at it at the bottom and communication, that is a hard one. If we look at our borderline patient on our psychiatric units, a good borderline, like a really strong borderline patient, will destroy your unit. They can be very difficult and complicated to have as a patient. They're the person who are going to try to turn like staff against each other. They will try to turn other patients against the staff. So this is the person who are going to be like, oh my gosh, I'm so glad you're working today. The other shift is just horrible. They're so mean to us. They're not as good of nurses as you. And we're left trying to figure out how do we respond to this? Because of course, if I'm day shift, of course I'm going to hate night shift. But I can't always tell that to the patient, right? We have to give that nice, good response. Everyone here is trying their best to take care of you. We can't feed into it. We have to look at that self-destruction, the feelings of emptiness, that afraid of separation, the emotional ability. We have to be on the lookout for all of those with this patient. When we look at borderline personality disorder, our nursing care, again, suicide, aggressive, and then they have high rates of abuse. In that mix between nature versus nurture, if we look at a female patient with sexual and physical abuse as a minor, we actually see changes to the corpus callosum if we were to go and image the brain. So we do see changes. That intense feelings of abandonment, we have to be matter-of-factly. I feel like that's what that should read. They will form relationships very quickly, but if something happens to that relationship, they feel it very strongly. CBT, individual group therapy, we actually also have something called DBT, dialectical behavioral therapy, which is kind of like CBT, but it looks at mindfulness and grounding techniques, which are very helpful for our patient with borderline. That self-destruction is something that must be addressed for safety. Meds, I honestly I've worked with a lot of borderline patients. I have never seen lithium used. Meds are going to be very widespread based on what else is going on in this patient. This, I think, is a clip we'll watch it in class on someone who is borderline, talking kind of about just what it is to be borderline. We have some iffy examples of borderline in TV and movie. Crazy Ex-Girlfriend is one show that is based on someone. Right, she's with the crazy ex-girlfriend who does have borderline. We also see it in Winona Ryder's character, I can't think of the name of the movie. I will think of it later. Um, It'll come to me at a time when I don't need to know it. Um, our next cluster B trait, and again, we have 2 slides for this one, is our antisocial personality. This is our last cluster B. So antisocial personality is not what we think it is, right? If we think, oh my gosh, my friend is so antisocial, we're thinking they don't want to go out to like the party. They want to stay home alone. However, remember when we talked about conduct disorder and our impulse control, those kids who are killing their family pet, they grow up to have antisocial personality disorder. So conduct disorder was the pediatric version. Antisocial is the adult. And a great example of like antisocial personality disorder is Jeffrey Dahmer. They are deceitful and they are manipulative for personal gain. So they will go out to the bar with you, but they're going to go out so they can meet someone and sweet talk them and drug their drink and take them home to like rape and kill them. And again, that is a very large example. Um, it does not always have to be that way. High risk taking, high criminal use, high substance abuse. They're concerned. They are doing everything for personal power and pleasure, right? Mob hitmen. There's a really good interview of a mob hitman who was antisocial. He had a family, he had a wife, he had kids, and he went to work and he killed people. And, right, it allowed him to have this life, and he didn't even think twice about it. That callousness we talked about in conduct disorder is still here. There's no empathy, there's no remorse, there's no feeling like bad about anything. They might have guilt because they're going to be punished, but that's it. So we can see I don't do serial killers. I don't remember if this is Dahmer or whatever one of them is, but again, those are who we see. We have to have boundaries and we have to have consequences. This patient will try to manipulate you. So we have to just say no. We're not often going to see this patient on a psych unit. But if we do, we have to look out because their manipulation might be different. Are they stealing other patients' food? Are they stealing the other patient's clothes? Well, I want your shoes, so I'm going to take your shoes. Well, I want an extra snack, and you have an extra snack, so I'm going to take your snack. That, again, is a very tiny example. If we have this patient and they want to do something, well, I want to make a phone call. Phone calls are 4 o'clock. Well, I want to make one now. We don't debate. Phone calls are at 4 o'clock. End of story. We have to set that boundary. Meds are going to be iffy. Meds are going to be iffy because we really need to look at what else is going on. We need therapy. Now, my movie example of this, it is not Cindy Lou Who. However, if we were to go through, and it's going to take a while, make me go through a commercial before we watch it. But if we watch my video, I should put a picture on here too. It's going to be the Grinch, especially in this old cartoon of the Grinch. He does not care about the Who's. He does not care about what's going on. He is going to steal Christmas because he does not like Christmas. And he goes and lies to little Cindy Lou Who about why he's stealing the tree, and he does not think twice about it. So our cluster C traits. Our cluster C traits are again a little bit different. This is a new cluster, so we're seeing different types of personality traits. They are anxious and fearful. Our first one we're going to talk about is something called avoidant personality disorder. You are going to confuse avoidant with schizoid and antisocial. So schizoid, they are a loner and they have no desire to have personal relationships. Antisocial are serial killers. And avoidant is someone who is going to have that one best friend. They will have one best friend who they've been best friends with forever, even if that person is mean to them, because I have a friend. And if I have a new friend, they might be mean to me. They're going to avoid contact with others because they are going to feel inadequate. They are going to feel inferior. We have to be friendly, but not too overly friendly, right? Accepting, reassure them. We have to recognize that new social situations can be hard for this patient and can cause them an excess of anxiety. We want to teach them assertiveness, right? Therapy, again, individual and group. This might be that silent individual and group therapy where they're a little bit quieter, where they're not kind of speaking out as much. So we might have to work on that in some different ways. If they're anxious, anxiety meds can be helpful, but again, it's going to depend on the patient. Now, my example of my avoidant personality, y'all might challenge us. We got Charlie Brown. So this is from the Peanuts movie. Charlie Brown always hangs out with Lucy, and she is so mean to him. But no matter what happens, he is constantly going back and he's constantly going to try to kick that football, and she's constantly going to pull that football away. That is one of the things that we see in avoidant. We are going to stay in that negative relationship, even in someone with mean to me. Now, you can see the clip is titled The Little Redhead Girl, and we will make sure we watch this in class. He has in this Peanuts movie such a huge crush on the little redhead girl, but he is so self-conscious about what she's going to think about him. She's not going to like me. She's going to think I'm stupid. He's trying to work really hard to impress her because he's very anxious about this relationship. That's what we see in the avoidant. They will be, 30, 40 years old and have had the same best friend since, elementary school. And even if that person's mean to them, they will stay in that friendship or relationship, even if it's negative, because it is less scary, less bad than meeting someone new. So when we look at our next cluster C, again, anxious and fearful, this is the dependent personality. They are very submissive. They will be very clingy. They're going to be afraid to be separated. They're going to want others to take care of them. They're going to be vulnerable to exploitation. Sometimes we might see, if we talk about that nature versus nurture, if we have someone who's very sick as a kid and they had an extremely helicopter parent, right, where the parent kind of always stepped in and took care of them. As they grow up, those traits might stay. Um, so we very much, when we look at our nursing care, we want to teach the patient assertiveness. We want them to make their own decisions. We want them to make their own choices. However, high levels of like separation anxiety, high levels of wanting others to take care of them. So if dependent personality is in a negative relationship and that relationship ends, they will then go find another relationship, even if it's a bad one, just so they have someone to take care of them. Again, psychotherapy is our treatment of choice. Psychotherapy, assertiveness training is what we want in this patient. Really nothing else that we can do. Cluster C. Oh, I don't have a person for that one. Oh, I'll have to find a person before the lecture next week. Anyway, cluster C, our last one, obsessive compulsive personality disorder. Now we have to be careful. We cannot confuse OCD and OCPD. We talked about OCD before. This is the person who has that intrusive thought that is causing that compulsive action, right? We saw that when we talked about anxiety. Well, OCPD is an unhealthy focus on perfectionism. I try to remember it. OCPD, that P that is added stands for perfection. They are preoccupied with order, control. They're stubborn, right? They're going to keep working on things. They're going to feel that their actions are right. They're going to have their self-imposed set of rules, and they're going to try to enforce those rules on other people. Rigid standards. They're going to focus more on like work and trying to get everything right than on their friends. However, if they start projects, they don't always finish their projects. They will have a whole craft closet full of unfinished crafts, because if that project cannot be perfect, they will quit because they will cause themselves so much anxiety trying to make it perfect. One of the big differences between OCD and OCPD is that OCD recognizes that they are being unreasonable. They recognize I should not have to wash my hands 20 times. I shouldn't have to get out of the car and perform this ritual. OCPD does not see anything wrong with their behavior. So what are we going to do as nurses? We are not going to power struggle. We might have to build an extra time. If they need to get up and perform this whole thing to make sure their room is like super spot neat and organized, we're going to allow them that extra time. We're going to try to look at unhealthy coping mechanisms. Are they using this perfection to cope with something? We tend to see this more in females. We tend to see this more in older daughters, especially if the mother had the condition. We tend to see this diagnosis more. This is one of our most frequently seen diagnoses. They just don't wind up in psych facilities. They may often seek out care, but they're seeking out care for anxiety, not for the OCPD. So remember we talked about borderline, we said we're going to see them more. We're going to see them more inpatient because of that risk of suicide. OCPD exists more within society. Therapy, again, is going to be our first choice. Meds are there, but again, they're often used for anxiety. And our example of who would be a good someone to look at who has OCPD or who might, again, fictional character, Monica from Friends. right? Monica doesn't think she's a perfectionist. And if we watch this clip, Rachel cleans the apartment, she rearranges the furniture, and Monica is like, oh my gosh, what did you just do? Like, you moved the ottoman, like, we have to move the ottoman back. And she doesn't recognize, and as her friends talk about and kind of call her out on some things, she does not recognize what is going on. She doesn't recognize that what she is doing is wrong. Um, and that's kind of that perfectionist, the wanting to push it on to everyone else. Rachel changed something, but we have to do it Monica's way. There are some videos on personality disorders, and if y'all have any questions, please reach out and let me know. Otherwise, I will see y'all in class.